There was a samurai swordsman. He'd been in the service of several warlords for many years, and he bore the scars of many battles and was tired to the very core of his being of war. But he had a question burning within his heart and soul. So he was drawn to a certain Zen master. And when he arrived at the Zen master's door, the master greeted him with a cup of tea in one hand and a long pipe in the other. But the Zen master invited the samurai swordsman to leave his sword outside the door, as was the custom. But the samurai swordsman refused, saying, "My sword goes with me wherever I am." So they entered the little abode of the Zen master, who invited the samurai to sit down in front of the little brazier that kept the room warm and also boiled the water for tea. But resting his cup on the edge of the brazier, when they sat down, suddenly the Zen master bumped his cup of tea, which splashed into the brazier and caused a great amount of smoke and ash to fly around the room. And of course it covered the sword that the samurai swordsman had left at his feet. And quietly the Zen master said, "Well, let's put the sword outside and we'll clean it later." But of course by this time the samurai swordsman had thought that he would leave. But the burning question in his heart was too great. So, sitting in front of the Zen master with a little brazier in their midst, suddenly the samurai swordsman burst out the question that had been burning inside of him: "Will the war ever end?" Now the Zen master was sitting quietly smoking his pipe, when suddenly he leant over and slapped the samurai swordsman across the face with his long pipe. Immediately the samurai swordsman's eyes filled with blood, and he reached for his sword, which wasn't there. So he paused for a moment, looking across at the Zen master, who sat serene and benign on the other side of the brazier. And the samurai swordsman thought to himself, "Well, I did ask him the question." And then came the thought, there has to be a reason. The Zen master looked across at the samurai swordsman and said, "You stopped the war." Then there's a story of the prince who, tired of the false life of the palace in which he lived, decided to go out into the world and learn the ways of life. in his travels, he happened to be walking by a stream one day when he saw an old man sitting under a tree, engrossed in a rather large book. So going up to the old man and greeting him in the usual way, the prince was inspired to ask, "What is this book that you're engrossed in, may I ask?" So the old man passed the large tome to the prince. But when the prince examined its contents, even though, having been educated in the many languages present in the world at that time, he could understand not one word. So he asked the old man, "Would you teach me this language?" The old man said, "This language cannot be taught. It can only be demonstrated. But if you will travel with me a while, perhaps you will learn how to do so." So they began to travel together, and after a long day, they found themselves at a rather palatial residence, thinking that they would seek hospitality for the night. But when they knocked on the beautifully carved, panelled door of this luxurious residence, and the door was opened by the autocratic and arrogant owner, who immediately said to them, "Go to the back door, and my servant will take care of you." So they were taken to the back door of that residence, where the servant gave them some stale bread and sour wine, and directed them to the barn where they could sleep on the hay that was laid for the animals. But the next day, in the morning, when they awoke, the old man took great pains to seek out the owner of that house and thank him profusely, almost to the point of getting down on his knees and genuflecting to him for his hospitality. And of course the prince was greatly surprised at this gesture, but having been told by the old man that he should not question anything that he witnessed, he kept his counsel, and they travelled on. The next evening they again came to a palatial residence, and knocking on the door, they were greeted by the owner, who welcomed them in graciously, inviting them to a repast that was like a feast, and then giving them a comfortable chamber each to sleep in. But to the very great surprise of the prince, when they were sitting down at the feast, which was served on golden platters, he witnessed the old man take one of these golden platters and slip it under his robe, stealing from their host. Now again, the prince had to keep his counsel, and they moved on. That night, after another day's travel, they came to a small inn run by an old widow who had as her assistant the son of the daughter of her own sister, a boy about 14 years old. They were invited to a simple meal of hot soup and freshly made bread, and given a place to sleep for the night. But the next morning, the old man approached the old woman and said, "We are travelers on a road, and I know that it is difficult to find our way from this point. Would you allow your helper, your nephew, to guide us along our way?" And so it was that the boy became an escort to the old man and the prince. But it wasn't long before they came to a rope bridge across a raging river. And it was halfway across that bridge, with the boy leading the way, that suddenly the old man began to rock that bridge, toppling the young boy over the edge, so that immediately he was lost in the raging torrent of that fast-moving river. Now the prince was absolutely aghast and horrified at the things that he had witnessed. But then the old man, standing in front of him, turned to face him, and suddenly, instead of an old and wizened hermit, there before the prince was an effulgent being of light, and that being said to the prince, "Ponder on the mysteries of that which you have witnessed over these last days, so that you may learn the language that will enable you to read the book that is now in your possession." Stories, in the way of stories, chemistry, energy, so the question remains, where are we? What is this place where we no longer need our sensory awareness to see? The mysteries that were once mysteries for us, no longer mysteries.